Melania Trump walked through the streets of New York, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. The city was alive as always, blaring horns, hurried footsteps, the distant hum of conversations blending into an urban symphony. She had always loved the city's energy, its relentless motion. But tonight, something pulled her attention away from the usual rhythm of life. On the corner of Fifth Avenue, huddled in the shadows between a row of high-end boutiques, she saw a man. He was crouched against the cold brick wall, his arms wrapped tightly around his knees, his clothes nothing more than rags barely clinging to his frail body. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes, sunken deep into their sockets, stared blankly at the concrete. A gust of wind blew through the streets, rustling the hem of her coat, and she shivered slightly. But the man, he did not react at all. It was as if the cold had long since stopped affecting him. Melania slowed her steps, hesitating. It wasn't the first time she had seen homeless people in New York, but there was something different about him. Perhaps it was the way he seemed to have disappeared into himself, a man who had become a ghost among the living. Perhaps it was the sheer absence of anything around him, no cardboard sign asking for help, no empty cup waiting for change, nothing but the hollow shell of a human being lost in time. She took another step closer, her designer boots inches away from his bare feet, which were cracked and bruised, his toes peeking through the holes of what had once been shoes. He didn't look up. Didn't move. For a moment, she simply stood there, watching him, trying to understand. Then, in a quiet voice, she spoke. "Excuse me." Nothing. No reaction. She tried again, a little louder this time. "Excuse me, sir?" His body flinched slightly at the sound of her voice, as if he had forgotten that people spoke to him at all. Slowly, hesitantly, he lifted his head. His eyes met hers, and in that moment, she saw something that made her breath hitch, a mixture of exhaustion, defeat, and something even deeper, something that had long since been abandoned. Hope. He blinked, as if unsure whether she was real or just another fleeting hallucination born from hunger and despair. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. "Are you hungry?" she asked, her voice softer now, more careful. A flicker of something passed through his expression. "I." His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "I don't know." The words sent a strange ache through her chest. She knelt beside him, ignoring the curious glances of passers-by who slowed their steps to watch. "I want to help you," she said gently. "Please. Let me." His gaze remained locked onto hers, searching, questioning. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he gave the smallest nod. And with that, something shifted. Melania took a careful step closer, her gaze locked onto the man's hollow, searching eyes. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice calm but firm, cutting through the thick silence between them. The man blinked, as if he had to remind himself how to form words. He swallowed, his throat dry, his lips chapped. "I have nowhere else to go," he finally murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, cracking from disuse. His fingers twitched against his knees as he lowered his gaze, almost ashamed to admit it. "No money. No food. No home." The last word seemed to linger in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Melania watched him carefully, her mind already working through the situation. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a neatly folded stack of bills. Without a word, she extended it to him. The man's eyes widened, darting from her face to the money and back again, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "Take it," she said gently, nudging it toward him. "Get yourself something to eat." He hesitated. His hands remained frozen in his lap, as if the simple act of accepting help was too foreign, too unreal. I can't," he stammered. "You can," she insisted. "And you will." His fingers trembled as he reached out, carefully taking the money as if it might vanish from his grasp at any moment. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, emotion flickering through his sunken eyes. "Thank you," he breathed, his voice thick. "Thank you. I don't know what to say." Melania offered a small, reassuring smile. "You don't have to say anything." The Mun clutched the money to his chest as though it were the most precious thing in the world. His lips parted again, but the words failed him. Instead, he simply nodded, overwhelmed. Melania straightened. "I'll be back," she told him, her tone firm. "Wait for me here." He looked up at her, confusion knitting his brow. "Why?" She didn't answer. She simply turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement once more. The Mun watched her retreating figure, still gripping the money tightly, as if afraid it might disappear. He sat in stunned silence for a long while before finally pushing himself up, his legs weak beneath him. He forced himself forward, step by step, heading toward the nearest food vendor, his heart hammering in his chest. He could barely remember the last time he had a warm meal. The thought made his stomach twist with both anticipation and disbelief. Meanwhile, Melania moved with purpose, her mind set on what needed to be done. She stepped into one of the boutiques she had passed earlier, ignoring the curious glances from shoppers and employees alike. She scanned the racks, her fingers grazing the fabrics, searching for something practical, something warm. When she emerged half an hour later, she carried a neatly wrapped bundle in her arms. The city's air had grown even colder by the time she returned to the spot where she had left him. For a fleeting moment, she feared he might be gone. But then, she saw him. He sat in the same place, though now there was a half-eaten sandwich in his hands, and a faint color had returned to his cheeks. His gaze lifted as she approached, and for the first time, there was something different in his eyes, not just gratitude, but something deeper. Something like disbelief that someone had actually come back for him. Melania knelt before him again, placing the bundle on the ground between them. "For you," she said simply. He stared at it, then back at her. "What is it?" "Open it." Hesitantly, he reached out and peeled back the wrapping. His breath hitched as he took in the sight of the clothes, warm pants, a thick sweater, a heavy coat. He ran his fingers over the fabric as if testing whether it was real. His lips parted, but no words came. For the first time in years, he felt something foreign, something almost forgotten. Hope. His hands clenched the fabric, his shoulders shaking. "I don't understand," he whispered. "Why are you doing this?" Melania met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Because I can," she said simply. The Mun exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around the clothes as if he feared they would slip through his grasp. He closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply. When he opened them again, there was something different in his face. A spark. A flicker of something long buried beneath years of despair. "I don't know how to thank you," he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. Melania stood, smoothing the fabric of her coat. "You don't have to," she replied. "Just don't give up on yourself." With that, she turned and walked away once more, disappearing into the city's endless night. The man sat there for a long time, staring after her, the bundle of clothes clutched tightly in his hands. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could change. Melania couldn't stop thinking about the Mun. Even after she returned home, his hollow eyes and trembling hands stayed with her. She had done what she could in that moment, given him food, warmth, but she knew it wasn't enough. A coat wouldn't change his life. A few dollars wouldn't erase years of struggle. He needed something more. Something lasting. Over the next few days, she made calls. She reached out to charities, shelters, organizations that specialized in helping the homeless rebuild their lives. But none of them seemed right. They had long wait lists, limited resources. He needed something now, not weeks or months later. So she took matters into her own hands. One evening, she visited a high-end hotel where she had connections. The manager was an old acquaintance, someone she trusted. She explained the situation, carefully choosing her words. "I need you to give someone a chance," she said. "A Mun who has nothing, but who deserves more." The manager hesitated, skeptical. "Melania, you know how these things go. We can't just—" "I'm not asking you to do it for free," she interrupted. I will personally cover anything he needs for the first few months. Training, transportation, whatever it takes. Just give him the opportunity." The manager sighed, rubbing his temples. "And you really believe he's worth it?" She met his gaze, unwavering. "Yes." That was the end of the discussion. The next day, she returned to the spot where she had first found the man. He was still there, though he looked different now. His hair, though still unkempt, had been washed. The coat she had given him was wrapped tightly around his frame. He looked up as she approached, his eyes widening in recognition. "You came back," he murmured. She smiled. "I told you I would." He shook his head, disbelief flickering across his features. "Why? Why do you keep coming back?" She crouched down in front of him, hands folded in her lap. "Because I believe in second chances," she said. "And I want to give you one." He stared at her, uncertain. "I don't understand." She took a deep breath. "I found you a job." His entire body stiffened. "A job?" "At a hotel," she explained. "Nothing too complicated at first. Housekeeping, maintenance, whatever they need. They'll train you, help you get back on your feet." His hands clenched around his coat. I can't," he said. "I don't even remember the last time I worked." "What if I fail?" Melania reached out, placing a hand over his. "Then you try again." He swallowed hard, his eyes glassy. "And if they don't want me?" "They will," she assured him. "But you have to show up. You have to try." Silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Okay." The next few weeks were difficult. The first day, he nearly didn't show up. Fear paralyzed him. He stood outside the hotel, staring at the doors, unable to move. But then, he thought of her. Of the kindness in her eyes, the quiet certainty in her voice. He forced himself forward. The work was hard. His body wasn't used to it. His hands ached, his back screamed, but he kept going. Every day, he showed up. Every day, he pushed himself. And slowly, things changed. The staff warmed up to him. He learned their names, their stories. He found a rhythm in the work. He saved every penny he earned, refusing to spend a cent on anything unnecessary. And one day, months later, he signed a lease for a tiny apartment, a place of his own. He stood in the empty living room, staring at the bare walls, the scuffed floors, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel something like pride. The first thing he did was buy a cheap phone. His fingers shook as he typed in the number she had given him. The call rang twice before she answered. "Hello." He swallowed, his throat thick. "It's me." A pause. Then, warmth in her voice. "How are you?" He looked around at his apartment, at the keys in his hand. He let out a shaky breath. "I'm good," he said. "I'm really good." They kept in touch after that. Not every day, not even every week. But often enough. She checked in on him, made sure he was still on the right path. And he was. He had a job. A home. A life. He still didn't know why she had chosen to help him. He had asked her once, and she had simply smiled and said, "Because someone had to." And maybe that was enough. Maybe, sometimes, all it took to change a life was one person who refused to look away. They saw each other often. Not because they had to, but because it became natural. At first, their meetings were sporadic, simple check-ins. Melania would call, and he would answer, his voice still carrying the weight of years spent on the streets, but each time, it grew lighter. She would ask how he was doing, and he would tell her about his job, about the people he worked with, about the small victories, his first paycheck, his first real meal in his apartment. The first night he slept in a bed that was his. And then, one day, he called her first. It was the first time he had initiated the conversation, and she could hear something different in his tone. A kind of hope, cautious but real. "Would you like to get coffee?" he asked. Melania paused, surprised but pleased. Of course. They met at a small cafe near his apartment. He had chosen it carefully, not too expensive, not too extravagant, just a quiet place where he could sit and talk without feeling out of place. When she arrived, he was already there, sitting at a corner table, nervously twisting a sugar packet between his fingers. He looked different now. His hair was trimmed, his clothes clean and pressed. He still carried the weight of his past in his posture, in the way his shoulders hunched slightly, as if expecting the world to turn against him at any moment. But there was something else too. Something steady. Something new. She sat down across from him, smiling warmly. "You look good." He let out a breathy chuckle, shaking his head. "I feel like I'm still pretending." "You're not," she assured him. "This is real." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to find the truth in her words. Then, slowly, he nodded. They talked for hours. About work, about life, about the small, mundane things that made up his days now. He told her about a coworker who had invited him over for dinner, about how strange it felt to sit at a table and be treated like he belonged there. She listened, offering quiet encouragement when he faltered, laughing when he did. And when it was time to go, he hesitated. "Can we do this again?" She smiled. "Whenever you want." And so, it became a habit. A friendship. They met for coffee, for lunch, sometimes just for a walk through the city. He began to talk more, to share pieces of himself he had kept locked away for so long. He told her about his past, not all at once, but in pieces, as if testing to see if she would flinch, if she would look at him differently. She never did. And in return, she shared her own stories, her own struggles, things she had never told anyone else. They learned each other in a way that had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with understanding. One evening, they sat on a bench overlooking the river, the city lights reflecting off the water. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I don't know what I would have done without you," he said quietly. She looked at him, taking in the sincerity in his eyes, the raw emotion in his voice. "You would have found your way," she said. "Maybe," he admitted. "But I don't think I'd be here. Not like this." He shook his head, exhaling. "I still don't understand why you stopped that day. Why you came back. Why you kept coming back." She thought for a moment before answering. "Because you mattered," she said simply. "Because you still do." He didn't say anything right away. Just looked at her, as if trying to memorize the moment, as if trying to hold on to something too big for words. And then, finally, he nodded. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the city move around them, two people who had once been strangers but were now something else. Something unspoken but understood. And as the night stretched on, he realized something that had once seemed impossible. He was happy. Not just surviving. Not just existing. But living. And for the first time in a long, long time, he allowed himself to believe that he deserved it.